What I wanted to do, since this is the first lecture, I will start with an introduction into what is digital twins, or how do we understand digital twins in the life sciences, because there are different definitions. But then I would also like to give you a bit of a 360-degree view on digital twins. What are the elements that are actually important in getting them from the screen to the patient? The legal, the ethical, the market space, all of those aspects are important. And then also give you a heads up into what is coming on the European level in terms of digital infrastructures that the European Commission is trying to build in order to facilitate the development and the credibility assessment of digital twins in the life sciences. So this is what will come. And I'll start with talking about digital twins and this new concept of virtual human twin. So digital twins, as we have, it's a definition, of course, that doesn't come from the healthcare sector. It comes from Industry 4.0, where it refers to a virtual representation of a physical object or a system across its entire life cycle, and it uses real-time data and other sources to enable learning, reasoning, and dynamic recalibration of the product or the process for monitoring diagnostics and prognostics. Now, what is very important there is this real-time interaction and this dynamic recalibration, meaning that we can only talk about a digital twin according to this definition if there's real direct interaction between the digital and the physical version. Now, if you think about situations in the healthcare sector where this is something that you could apply, I'm not sure if you can if anything immediately comes to mind, but there are very few cases where we can actually measure a lot of things in real time, other than the things that you can measure externally, like your blood pressure or your heart rate, and those things can actually not so easily be intervened on. Dynamic recalibration of your systems, your organs, your cells is somewhat more tricky in a life sciences situation than it is when we're talking about structures and processes of dead materials. So what we have done as a first step when we started working with large groups of people on developing visions for digital twins in healthcare is define a definition. And this one looks more like personalized computer modeling and simulation, because it says that digital twins in healthcare are the direct use of individual-specific models for prevention, prediction, screening, diagnosis, and treatment of a disease, as well as the evaluation, optimization, selection, de-risking, and personalization of intervention options. That means that these models that will be used will be informed by patient data, but maybe only once in the entire life cycle of the model, maybe multiple times, but the frequencies are very or the frequency is not steady. So this if you want to be very picky, you could say that this turns definition, or that this makes digital twins simply a synonym for personalized computer modeling and simulation. Now, because we did have some issues with people insisting on the fact that digital twins really need to have that real-time connection, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the US made a report a couple of years ago on this very topic, and they specifically tried to come up with a compromise on having this interaction. So they said that for other applications as well, but especially in health and care, this interaction can happen through human-in-the-loop decision-making. So that means that a doctor takes a decision on an action based on a digital twin, and that is also the feedback from the virtual to the physical counterpart, for instance. So with that in mind, if we think about types of digital twins, you'll see examples that are coming that are very much personalized, subject-specific digital twins. So they are able to capture a specific measure of the patient with a specific precision and expected precision, so that we can actually use so that it matches the clinical or the experimental observations. Now, many of these models, of these digital twins models, are not built immediately from the patient. If we're talking about AI technologies, then yes, this is built on the patient's data. So this is a subject-specific digital twin. If we're talking about other types of models, this sometimes starts from a more generic twin, where a generic digital twin, which seems a bit a contradiction in terms, is where we have a model, a digital twin model that captures a behavior that we expect somewhere in the realm of the possibilities. So it gives a reasonable result on a biological process or a product. A population-specific twin is one step further, where we try to aim the behavior of the twin in such a way that it captures some measure of the population, usually the average or the mean, and that it has some variability that is possible that captures also that variability within the reference population, but it's not yet for a single person. Now, for example, the lecture that you will see from LM, they didn't go from generic to population-specific to subject-specific. They went from generic to subject-specific and then created 100 subject-specific models to create a population. So this is not a 1, 2, 3 steps, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand that in the R&D process of digital twins, you don't necessarily immediately have a very subject-specific digital twin. Now, when I'm talking about digital twin, I frequently say model. I also need you to know that a digital twin, of course, is not just a software component. It is one of the 3 components. There is also a very important hardware component to a digital twin. This hardware is there to provide the sensor input, so the sensing part, or the medical images to create subject-specific envelopes for your models, but also the computing hardware. If we have very compute-intensive models, then we need HPC infrastructure. So that also is part of the hardware for digital twins. And then the transition between the hardware and the software, this integration, the communication, the management of all this data happens through middleware. Middleware is usually not talked about so much. You'll find a lot of information on hardware, you'll find a lot of information on software, but the middleware is the realm of expertise of a very specific group of people. Now, today, I will mostly focus my story from the side of the software, the digital twin models, always assuming that there is the appropriate hardware that is present in order to compute them, but also in order to provide input and feedback. So if then go a bit further into what a digital twin could be or what a digital twin could be about, we are not talking about one model to capture the entire human being. That is not the point. Maybe at some point this might happen. This is a nice aspiration, but as engineers, we try to design our models to answer specific questions. As clinicians, you want to use the model to address a specific patient, which means that we need to have something that will allow us to do exactly what we want to do and not more, because that would be extra, that would be ballast, that would make it more difficult to get these things approved by the regulators, and it would not help our specific question. So at the moment, we're looking at twins of different aspects. Cells, you can have digital twins of individual cells, of tissues, of organs, of the entire system. If there is a specific question, you can have twins of specific therapies, and I will explain this example in a bit more detail so you understand later what it is that you're looking at here. You can also have digital twins of the manufacturing process. When you have a bioreactor, for instance, where you're culturing cells for tissue engineering therapies, in order to understand what is happening to your cells, you can use digital twins of the bioreactor setup. And then you can have digital twins of the entire medical facility, especially during COVID. This was very useful to streamline the walking paths of people, but this is also routinely used for optimizing logistical processes in medical facilities and elsewhere. So all of these can be digital twins. Now, I already mentioned AI, and I mentioned also other technologies. Well, just to make a point here, in silico technologies are a spectrum. They can go from really data-driven black box models, that's the classical AI machine learning, all the way to white box models that are driven by physics. Now, if we take an example, for instance, you can use AI models to identify abnormal shapes, to look for tumors in lungs. You can use white box models to actually create medical images. That's something that many people don't realize, that if you use medical images, you are using white box models, because there is a lot of physics involved in translating the raw images into the things in the images that we're used to looking at. And that is because there is physics that is used to translate this. So this is a purely physics-based white box model. Now, when we're talking about models of biological processes, we rarely have enough data to build these models from scratch, but also we don't know everything that is going on. We don't know all of the mechanisms to translate them into mathematics to build white box models. So usually we are somewhere in this gray zone where we take the mechanisms that we know and we complement them with data. Of course, when you have a question that you want to answer with a digital twin, the first thing to do is decide which technology to use. And that really depends on how much you know about your problem and how much data you have at your availability. If you don't know so much and you have a lot of good quality, high volume data, you will use AI approaches. If you don't have so much data, or it's pretty sketchy, but you have some idea or some hypothesis on the mechanisms that are behind the disease or the functioning, you can use more white box or gray box approaches. So this is important to realize. What I will be saying from now on does not make any assumption on the kind of in silico technology that will be used. Now, to further illustrate what digital twins are or can be and how they can be used, I'm going to give you, I think, 4 examples in total to set the scene a bit further. The first one is an example from the University Medical Center in Amsterdam. It's called My DigiTwin. And this is one where they gave, or where they asked to patients or to citizens whether they could have access to their medical records, and combining this with any other data that the patient had from their wearable devices. They combined this data and then compared the data and the evolution of the data, especially focusing on the heart rate, with some of the data that was available in databases with patients. So they knew they had data from patients at various stages of specific diseases, and they were then comparing the input from the patient, or from these new patients with the question mark, with the data that they already had, in order to determine or to find out if there was a risk for specific diseases. And so this allowed them to detect very early in the onset a higher risk for specific conditions, and they could ask the patient to actually come in and immediately address this issue before it became a disease or before it became an urgency. So this is how they're using this in order to work more on prevention and proactive rather than reactive care. They are now extending this also to larger parts of the city in order to involve people that not necessarily would participate in these kinds of things, to really have a very good census of the entire population and how this might help them. Another example is an example of what could be very close to an actual digital twin in the strictest definition that you could have, and that is on intensive care unit, and more specifically on glycemic control in the intensive care units. So patients are on a steady infuse with the food, or with glucose or fructose or sucrose, I guess, and then they are measured. So the insulin levels or the blood glucose blood glucose levels, are measured repeatedly. And based on that, it is decided whether a patient should get some insulin in order to make sure that the blood glucose levels are not too high or not too low, because they've seen that both influence have a negative influence on the speed of recovery of the patient. Now, the problem is, if you are on the left with the fixed dosing system, you will get very variable blood glucose levels. So the red line at the left is the blood glucose levels. Patients respond differently. Patients have different levels. If they give everyone the same protocol, then you have big variations in patients' blood glucose levels over time. Now, what the idea is that if you can measure them, if you can take these measurements, and if you can use a digital twin, you can also use the digital twin to actually suggest what would be a better protocol to apply insulin to the patient, so that the variability is actually removed from the glucose levels. The way the people in Liège did this is by taking, on the one hand, a model that had the mechanisms of how the body, the main metabolic components of the body. And then they used an additional part that was AI-driven, that was identifying the insulin sensitivity. So there was this one parameter that is important to understand how a patient responds to insulin, because it's not the same for everyone. And that was then done by comparing input data from the patient with a large database that they had collected in the clinical study, so that they can derive this measure. And these two parts combined then give the glycemic control that is used at the moment still under the control of a nurse, that then takes the suggestions of the model and applies it in the patient management. Now, you can then use the same kind of model to do other things, to try new mechanisms or new regimes, to use it as digital patients for in silico clinical trials, to look at other questions. So this is an additional side use of this, rather than just for the actual patient as a virtual population. The third example is the left atrial articular occluder appendicular occluder device. So we actually have an appendix in our heart, and that is what you see here on the right-hand side. This little blob, that is the appendix. If we zoom in, you see it here. And for patients with atrial fibrosis, this can lead to blood clotting. So what then happens is that they try to occlude, stop this or the access of the blood flow to this appendix. And there are a number of devices that can be used for this. There are also this shape that you see here that is nicely rounded. It's not always the same with patients. There are different groups. And I know one of them, by the researchers at least, is affectionately called chicken wing. I don't remember the names of the other two main shapes, but suffice to say, there are different shapes. So when you have a patient that comes in, there are different ways or different occluder devices that can be used. What sometimes happens is, if in a surgery you started to go with one device, it doesn't entirely fit. You need to use another device. This is not such a great situation, well, not for the patient, not for the surgeon, but also not for the company, because there's only reimbursement for one device and not for the two that were used. So if I click on the video, well, I don't understand why the video isn't. Oh, there we go. The video is playing. What they then do is they take a digital twin of the atrium. It's been flipped with respect to the previous slide. And then they simulate the blood flow with the occluder. And here you see, if you look at the arrow, there is still blood passing by the occluder into the appendix, which is a situation that they had tried to avoid. So you can use this to plan the surgery. You can also use it to evaluate the success of the surgery later on. Okay, example 4 is the one from the lung digital twin, also an image that you've already seen. This is from Oklahoma State University, where they have generated personalized models of the trachea. But then when you look at the alveoli, here they used an idealized shape to simulate them. And then they can simulate breathing cycles. Now, how are they using this? For instance, to look at the design of inhalers. If you look at an inhaler, what they did here is they color-coded different parts of the lungs, and then they looked in this transection of, so this cross-section here of what comes out of the inhaler, and then looked at all of the particles that are at these different places in the cross-section, see where they ended up in the lungs. And what you can see here is that, specific parts of the lungs actually receive particles coming from specific parts of the inhaler cross-section, which means that if the patient doesn't perfectly apply the inhaler and part of the inhaler actually, or part of the particles end up at the top of the mouth, for instance, then only part of these particles are reaching the lungs, and that means that part of the lung tissue is not receiving any drugs. So we need to find a way to optimize the design of the inhaler so that regardless of how good the patient is in applying or using the device, that all the parts of the lung actually get drugs. So what the colleagues in Oklahoma did was to play with different parameters, play with the design that have to do with the design of the inhaler device. So there is a difference in the length that they applied, and also a difference in the speed with which the particles were released. So that is this Q here. And if you then see that by changing especially this length of the inhaler and then also changing the speed, you can get a much better mixed profile. It's not so much that the profile in the inhaler is mixed, but it's that there is no such dependency between the place where the particles end up and the place where they started in the cross-section of the inhaler. And so that allows a patient, even when it's not perfectly applied, it allows all the parts of the lungs to actually receive some drugs. Okay, and then a last example. We've already seen digital twins really for the patient, for the physician, for optimization of devices. And here is the last one that also has to do with the optimization of devices, and that is for in silico clinical trials. This one is an example from 2018 already, where Medtronic wanted to make a pacemaker that did not have the issues that you sometimes see when you go to an MRI. You see a symbol of a pacemaker with a forbidden sign on it. It's not because the pacemaker will be ripped out, but that's because this lead wire here leading up to the electrode, this one in a magnetic field will cause an electromagnetic field and will lead to heating of the tissues around this lead wire. And so you would actually get wounds on the inside because of this. Now, patients are already put in an MRI, even if they have a pacemaker in some cases. And not all of these lead wires always lead to big problems, but still it is a counterindication. And the producers or the manufacturers don't really want it. So what Medtronic wanted to do, given that, of course, patients that have a pacemaker, they also age, they also need get ill, they need MRIs. They changed the design of this lead wire in order to reduce the level of variation of the electromagnetic field that would arise when you put this lead wire that passes electricity in a magnetic field. That reduced this variability or this electromagnetic field that was created to the level of the normal electromagnetic fields that we all have, so that there would be no thermal reaction as a result of it. And the way they did that is they did tests. So they redesigned the lead wire. They put this in a salt bank to test it in vitro. They also had one animal experiment that was running for something else in which they tested this new design. And what they used this animal experiment for was to look at the model that they had built, the in silico model that they had built, and compare the results of the predictions of this model with the results that they got from the imaging to show that their model actually was able to capture the physics, because we're still talking about physics, the physics of the situation. Now, with that, they upscaled this to a human population using also the real world data that they had been collecting from the devices that are already in use. And so they built a virtual population that had different geometries in terms of the orientation and the exact positioning of the lead wire, so that they had various patient anatomies that they could simulate. And in total, they simulated 2.3 different million scanning scenarios. So you had the different patients, but also different sequences that are used in the MRI. And that was 2.3 million in total. And for none of them, the variation of the electromagnetic field around the lead wire was higher than what you see as the normal physiological variation in people. So with this information, they went to the regulator, to FDA, and they were approved for use in humans. So they got their marketing approval without doing an in silico clinical trial. So just based on the results of the in silico clinical trial, which meant that they didn't have to do the otherwise 2-year follow-up, 250 patient clinical study. So that means the product was on the market 2 years earlier. They could start making money. They didn't have to pay for the in silico clinical trial. So this is a very clear example of how financially this is beneficiary, and also for the patients, because now you have 10,000 patients that do have a pacemaker that is allowed in an MRI. Now, this again is a very specific case because we're talking about a digital twin of a physics-based digital twin. So it's pure laws of physics. With biology, this would be much more tricky because there is more variability and more uncertainty. So doing in silico clinical trials can work. A full replacement of clinical studies can work, but only in specific cases. All right. Now, if you look at these examples that I gave, what do they have in common? Well, they focus on a single organ or a single scale of the model. Whereas we know that a lot of problems can only be answered if you are looking at different organ systems together, or if you are looking at different scales for a single organ system. Also there are examples, but they are farther between, and they are further away from translation into the patient. If you look at companies that offer in silico services, they focus mostly on the examples that I just showed, and not so much on these multi-scale and multifactorial models. So it's actually there that the European Commission saw a need. If we want to go towards more comprehensive digital twins, or called in this case virtual human twins, because of course they need a brand as well. To go towards virtual human twins, we actually need to find a way to combine everything that we know and to have all these developers and all these models that are available, all these data sets, to have them talk to one another. Because at this moment, a lot of things are done in the European Union, but we don't always find these results back. There's no good place. There are some repositories for models, there are some repositories for data, but not all the models and not all the data sets fit in those repositories. So there is definitely a need for a place, a home for a number of these models, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Plus also workflows and algorithms that are useful are not so easily shared. And so this is part of what the European Commission aims to do with this virtual human twins initiative, something that they kicked off officially at the end of 2023 in Barcelona as their next flagship, one of their next flagship initiatives. So they want to work on a collaborative ecosystem. They want to build a platform that will allow to gather all these models and provide access to data sets, whether they are in the repository of the virtual human twin, the VHT, or elsewhere. And they want to use this actually to break down the silos and to work on the interoperability. Now, in order to do that, they started a coordination and support action, that's CSA, that we call EDITH. EDITH stands for Ecosystem and Digital Twin of Digital Twins in Healthcare. And they asked that consortium to work on bringing together the whole ecosystem for digital twins and to develop a roadmap to go towards the integrated virtual human twin. In order to do that, we had to also work on a proof of concept infrastructure, a repository, a simulation platform to better understand the specific needs of the digital twin community compared to needs of other communities that are also already using data repositories and platforms. Now, to start doing that, we worked on we started by first making a pragmatic definition of a virtual human twin. And rather than making reference to the digital twin definition, we said, when we're talking about the initiative, the virtual human twin, this should be a systematic and ever-growing digital and quantitative representation of all the actionable knowledge that we have on pathophysiology. It should contain a European platform that will allow pooling of resources and assets. And in this case, resources and assets are data sets, models, algorithms, compute power, storage capacity, essentially taking the community and connecting them to everything that they would need in order to develop digital twins in healthcare and to assess also their credibility, because that's essential in order to make the last step towards the clinic. And this means that we need to develop a federated public infrastructure that will allow and collect the appropriate resources. And this can only happen if you have a collaborative ecosystem. So this is what we set out to do for, for 2023 and 2024. This was what a number of activities were organized in order to bring together the ecosystem and to develop all these things. Now, when I talk about the VHT ecosystem or the community of practice, as you see here in the middle of the slide, then this is really anybody and everybody that has an interest or a stake in this endeavor. And of course, it starts with patients and civil society organizations here at the bottom in the middle, because they have the need. They present they're the beneficiaries and the users along with the healthcare providers. Now then there is a group that represents the VHT creators, which are the research and innovation actors, hospitals, academia, hospitals, research institutes, industry actors, anybody that is helping in developing specific VHT or digital twin applications. There are then the ones that enable the VHT. Those are the infrastructure actors, for instance, the HPC facilities, but also enabling through funding and financial actors. So these are the European Commission, for instance, other funding agencies that provide the tools that are necessary or the handles that are necessary to develop and to the developers to create these digital twins. And then there is, of course, the whole setting in which this takes place. This is not just developing a product, this is developing a healthcare product, which means that there are very specific legislative aspects that need to be respected. There are ethical dimensions that are important. There is the social acceptance. And there are, of course, the governing factors. There is the whole setting of regulators and health technology agencies, or assessment agencies that intervene when we're talking about healthcare products. So those are the managers of the VHT and have to do the governance. And then the one that I skipped here are the communities, because this is not something, if we want to talk to all those people, yes, you can talk to individual patients, you can talk to individual healthcare providers, but they don't speak for the entire community. So we've also focused on establishing links with community representatives, because they are facilitators. They are the actors that can help to actually gather within their own community, within their own part, what are the needs, what are the questions, what are the fears. And so they are very important there as well. Now, I can break this down a little bit more. Just not going to go through all of this. There is, at the end, I have a link to the EDIT website and the Zenodo, where you can find the deliverables, and also in the roadmap we go a bit more in detail on all of these different factors and who they are, and how they are organized. Now, just at this point, it's really important to mention that we have really talked to all of them. We've done SWOT analyses, we've done needs analyses for all of these different stakeholders to get a good idea of what people expect from digital twins, what they need, and how we should progress in the roadmap to build this platform that will be of use to anyone. Here I have another image of how this works when we're talking about ecosystem organizations. So we have on the left-hand side the VPH Institute, which is representing nonprofit organizations. On the right-hand side, the Avicenna Alliance, which represents industry together with the nonprofit organizations. And they really sit between the technical implementation, who are the members of these societies, and then the policymakers, who we are speaking to together as a community. All right, now, this is the context. You know what digital twins are, what the ecosystem is. Now we want to lay the puzzle of virtual human twin science and see how we need to do that. Now, when you make a puzzle, there are different ways of approaching it. I was taught by my mom to first look at the sides so that you have the boundary and that you know in which everything sits. This is actually the need that we have been identifying for the different stakeholders. So we've been talking to different stakeholders, trying to understand what it was that they wanted, what was the unmet medical need that could be addressed by virtual human twins, what was the policy need, what was the market need, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, we had a clinical survey on in silico medicine that we had completed, or for which we did already a first version a couple of years ago, where we tried to understand what people know about, in this case, it was in silico medicine in general. What were their fears? What were their expectations? What were their experiences? And this led to the definition of a SWOT that gave us insights into all of these aspects that were very important to determine the need. And I messed up the order here of the slides, but this is essentially how you also approach the design of a medical device. You're not there to push your technology onto your clients. You actually go to prospective clients, to patients, to healthcare providers, and you try to understand what is the problem that they need to have solved. So what is their need? And if once you have their need, you can build your technology in order to address that need, rather than do something that you really like and then find out at the end of the line that there's actually nobody that is waiting for the solution that you are providing. So we've been talking a lot to industry, to clinicians. And when you look at industry, we've talked to small companies, large companies, medtech, so medical devices, pharma, software, to understand what it is that they would expect from an initiative like the VHT and such a public platform. So access to resources is one of them that they all mentioned. Of course, there are different variations depending on who you talk to, but these 7 are the ones that came up almost all the time. So access to resources, use it as a sandbox, as a benchmark, to benefit from technologies that were developed because of the VHT platform that they could then also use. The provision of clarity and certainty on the ethical, legal, and social issues. And then they could use this also to find partners and to find new commercial opportunities. When talking to clinicians, then they clearly wanted solutions for their unmet medical needs. They wanted it to improve patient outcomes, to reduce cost and enhance the care quality, and also assist in providing care in a context where you have an aging healthcare provider population, and also a reduction in the amount of time that people have. This also means that there needs to be a seamless integration of these technologies in the clinical workflow, that access to data is important, and also the annotation of data in order to make sure that we can do something with all of that data that is there. Now, with this boundary, we can look at some of the other building blocks. And then I'm sneaking in here just a few slides on my team that you see here. You have a lot of people doing a lot of research in this field. And for instance, in our team, we do research on biomechanics and computational tissue engineering in a skeletal concept. So we work on models that are related to anything skeletal and toxicology. So we use bioinformatics, we use systems biology, we use mapping to identify the intracellular biology, but then we also look at the effect of mechanics, look at biomechanics, try to understand the bioprinting and the bioreactor processes, again, always using digital twins. And then we put this all together in models of the different processes that we're looking at, and we share the tools that we are developing in the same way as we have used tools that other people have been sharing. So these are individual building blocks that can go into a platform like the virtual human twin. Now, this needs to be connected. I have maybe made a model. If I go back to this one, the multi-scale model of the ONE, we had a model of the intracellular behavior of the chondrocyte. That's the cell in the cartilage. And we have models that look at gait mechanics, and we can quantify the mechanical load in the articular knee, in the articular cartilage of the knee joint. But these two need to be connected if we want to understand osteoarthritis, which is a process that takes place at all these levels and requires the mechanics at the joint level and the biology at the cellular level. So we need to be able to make connections. And for this, rather than reinvent the wheel all the time, this is where this platform that the Commission wants to build can be really useful, because it starts with, if we look at the platform, it starts with building a catalog or a repository, a data space where you can either access directly data that has been shared by people, or where you find in the catalog where data sets that are relevant for you might elsewhere be stored. If we're looking at European health data space in the future, well, this catalog would be then telling you, well, the EHDS has a data set and you can access it so and through this and this way. Now, there would also be in this platform models that then can be connected with data. So you see here that we need to work on the metadata of the models and of the data sets, so that we can understand or that they can understand whether they're good for one another, whether they're a good fit. Now, with this combination of data and models, we should be able to run simulations and do some initial validation of these models using, if it is required, advanced computing infrastructures that are available in the European space. Then you can take this out of the platform and use this to go towards regulatory and uptake, but that is beyond the realm of what the European Commission foresees in their platform. So what does this look like for an individual? Well, I go through my terminal, I go to the VHD, I look in the catalog, I can access things, I can find matches between my data and my models, I can run them, I can use workflows that orchestrate the connection between either models and data sets or between different models. And I can then also script the whole thing and take it out if I want to go towards clinics, because the whole VHT platform will not be going to the regulator, but it's taking out a specific part and then bring this further to the regulatory approval. Now, this space would be like a data space, and the models would be crawling across this data space. So using metadata to always understand, is this data set useful? Can I act on this? Yes or no? So if you want to have a very high level understanding, this is how we see this. And you can go pretty far in this analogy, because you could say, well, every time a data set is added to this, the VHD infrastructure, the models that are there can wake up and can see, is this data set useful for me, yes or no? If it is, well, you can hard code what you want to be done. Do you want the model to immediately act on this data space and generate an in silico result or not? Of course, if you want it to immediately react, then you need to foresee space, you need to foresee compute power, which are not free. But these things are all options that you can think of. To realize such an infrastructure, you need to have work done, of course, on the technology, on the individual resources, on the integration of resources, on the connection with other initiatives like the European Health Data Space, like the compute infrastructure. And for instance, if I look at the word integration, to say how I realize that this slide is very naive, if we talk about integration in this slide, this breaks down into a whole host of other issues. For instance, integration between models. How do you do that? Different levels, so the tissue and the intracellular model. But this could also be integration between the heart and the lung, or some models really require a very tight coupling, so they need to become one model, one new model. And some models maybe can just take data output from one model as the input for the next one and then back. And so you can have a loosely coupled integration. There's also integration of data that are sometimes very different in quality and quantity. Like if you have images and wearables, or you have omics data and wearables of the same patient, it's very different in terms of data types and structures. Now, there's also, of course, the integration of models and data, who most likely will not be co-localized. We might have more models in the VHD infrastructures than we will have data sets. And then, of course, these data sets needs to be found elsewhere. They might be behind the firewall of a hospital, where then rather than taking the data out of the hospital, we should find a way to bring the model in a containerized form to the data. So there are these all these aspects that sit behind the one word integration in this slide. But what is important is that it's not just work only on the technology, it's also work on the ethical, legal, social issues, on the users, on the sustainability. And I will go into more detail on some of those, so I'm not going to discuss all of these words on this slide. One example of bringing this to the patient is using additional technologies. And for instance, here you see some examples of virtual reality from the colleagues at Gosh, where virtual technology can be used on the left-hand side to actually do planning of your surgery. In the middle, you see several courses that are being taught from London to audiences that are elsewhere. So do teaching of medical professionals. And on the right-hand side, this is a movie that you can also find on the website of Gosh, where a young patient is coming in, needs to undergo cardiac surgery, and they're using VR to actually explain to the patient what exactly will be done during that surgery. Right, so this is the technology part. Now we have the sides, we have the individual pieces. We also have enabling elements. You could say this is the cardboard that the pieces are cut from. It can also be the table on which you make your puzzle. And that is the regulatory, the standards, and the ethical, legal, social issues that we need to address. If you look at how technologies are translated to the patient, you have a top layer that is the government and the inter and non-governmental organizations that create guidelines and rules and laws. So then we're talking about policymakers, regulatory bodies, but also OECD for good laboratory practice. We're talking about ICH for the good clinical practice, and other standards organizations like ISO and ASME. What they do is they make standards, certifications, and also good practices. That is the second layer. Those can be sector specific. And then each organization takes this whole set of rules and internalizes these into their quality management system and creates standard operating procedures to do things in a way that can stand the test of the regulator or the quality assessment agency. Now, if you look at the middle layer, there's one thing that is missing, and that was pretty intentional. There is at the moment no GSP, so no good simulation practice, but we're working on that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So we've been very active over the last, and we as in the community has been very active in the last, 15 years, let's say, talking to regulators, especially FDA, who has been also very proactive because they have a lot of engineers that work with that are used to working with enabling technologies and with models, but also with the European Medicine Agency, with other regulatory bodies across the world, in order to set the rules. If I want digital evidence or the results of my digital twins of my computer model to be used in a dossier for approval of a medical device, or if I want my model to be approved as a medical device for clinical decision support, for instance, what are the criteria upon which regulators will judge these models? What is the evidence that you need to provide in order for regulators to accept your applications? So these rules we've been discussing for quite some time. There is now a standard, the VMV 40 standard, verification and validation standard by the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, that focuses specifically on computer modeling for medical devices. We're now also working with ISO. There is a dedicated group in ISO that is working on more global criteria for the verification validation of models, not just mechanistic models or physics-based models like here, but also the AI compartment for use in healthcare science. So to have an ISO standard on this as well. So when we take all of this together, there's quite a lot that is already available. So if you want to start in this field and you want to know where you're at, it might become a bit difficult to see the forest for the trees. So that is why with a few colleagues, we decided to start writing a white paper and propose a good simulation practice, or propose that it was time to establish a good simulation practice. Now, a lot of people were interested, so this became a group of over 100 people from academia, industry, from regulators, from health technology assessment agencies, and from ethics and social sciences that wanted to contribute to this. And we used the table of contents of the good clinical practice, and we mirrored this for our good simulation practice proposal. Now, in the end, this turned out to be an 80,000 word white paper. So we published it as a free book that you can see here. I will share the slides afterwards so you can look this up, which is a really nice work, or a really nice introduction if you want to, learn about the state of the art, both in model building, but also the regulatory aspect, etc. FDA reviewed each chapter and also has written the foreword, which gives it not an official label, but at least it makes it quite credible. Now, one thing that is important for regulatory science is the following of standards. You might think, well, digital twins is something relatively new in healthcare, so there may be no standards that are very specific. Now, there are actually a lot of standards that do have something to do in this space. And so colleagues from the EDIT consortium developed this fair sharing collection of 149 different standards that actually are related in some way, shape, or form to digital twins. So there is definitely some stuff that is already standardized. Question is, do you need one standard to rule them all? And I'll give you a minute to look at this cartoon. So we decided that at the moment it was maybe not worthwhile to go for one standard for all digital twins, also because in health and care, there is a huge variety in the types of data that we have, the way they are collected, and in the types of models that are applied. These are not just PK/PD models for those that are in pharmaceutical sciences, so pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic models, where you have a very well-established way of doing things, types of data that go in and go out, software that is used, and the regulators use this and expect this. But there is so much more in modeling and simulation that it's really difficult to capture all of this in standards. Even in community standards, we have community standards like CellML, like StatML, and others, but they don't cover everything. So the idea is that we need to try and get this done as standardized as possible, but without trying to impose too broad standards, more approaches that are used as good practice. Okay, then we're verging from the standards and the regulatory into the legal territory. If we look in the European context, what laws are affecting the possible uptake and use of digital twins in health and care? Well, there are quite some. GDPR, everybody is aware of the GDPR. But also recently, the European Commission, the previous Commission and Parliament have worked a lot on the Data Governance Act, on the Data Act, on the AI Act. They've approved a version of, or a text of, the European Health Data Space that will be very important, because that would be a way to share all this data. There's also the medical device regulation, the in vitro diagnostic medical device regulation, that are, of course, also talking that mention in silico, but that would actually be interacting or overlapping with the AI Act when we're talking about modeling and simulation for healthcare. Other than that, you have, of course, the Cross-Border Health Directive, Trade Secrets Directive, clinical trial regulation that is also has some requires maybe some updates. And then there is the Biotech Act that von der Leyen actually announced that should be worked on this year and the next year, that should also address some issues related to animal testing and also clinical trials. So a lot of legal texts are there, and these legal texts are not always entirely crystal clear themselves. So sometimes we have to wait for the rulings of the European Court of Justice to see how to interpret certain things, like absolute and relative anonymization or pseudonymization in the GDPR, for instance. But some of them also overlap. I already mentioned the MDR and the AI Act. They, when you have an AI algorithm that is used as a medical device, then which one takes precedence, because they don't always fully align. So there are some recommendations that have been made, that we've made in the consortium, to solve these, or to identify these potential issues that might stand in the way of a good translation of digital twins in health and care, and ways how to address them. So there are, for instance, the divergent interpretations by member states also, because some of these are given an extra layer in the individual member states. There is the height threshold for anonymization that I already mentioned. There are uncertainties in the definition of AI system and the exceptions for research. There was an exception for research in GDPR, but it hasn't really facilitated things in many cases. There are overlapping legislations, especially talking about risk classification, that is not the same. And there are missing EU-wide guidances on the regulatory acceptance for digital twins in clinical trials, for instance. So that hinders the fact that in silico isn't mentioned in the clinical trial, makes it more difficult for people that want to do that to convince the regulators or to convince notified bodies to look at this data. And then, of course, if we're talking about large-scale sharing of tools and resources, well, we don't want to cut down the competitiveness of Europe. So intellectual property is something that is also important, and in order to clarify on how to deal with that in the context of virtual human twins. Moving on from the legal to the ethics, there are, of course, a lot of ways to look at ethics, and all of them can apply in some way to the digital twins. I'll maybe just we did a whole analysis with the working group. There are, of course, ethical legal challenges. So the ones that really are to do with privacy, data protection, the accuracy, who owns this thing. But there are also challenges related to autonomy and fairness. So is the patient still autonomous? Can we do this new bit of technology in healthcare without increasing or decreasing the equality? Are we still being fair with respect to all of the citizens? Are we not becoming over-dependent on technology? So those are some of the questions that can be looked at. And then there are broader challenges. The principle of identity. Is a digital twin an extension of me? So something that is, or is it a tool that I own? So it's somewhere between being and having. The ethics of human enhancement but that goes for all medical technologies. But can we use this to enhance humans? And if we can, should we? And then what is really important, so ultimately, is that we are asking these questions as we are developing the technologies and not afterwards. So ethics by design, making sure that we do co-creation, that we ask these questions, that we bring on board the specialists in this domain so that they can help guide the development of technology in a way that will lead to an ethical outcome. And for instance, this is an example of the data privacy, the ethical and legal governance. When you create a tool for a digital twin, people sign up, people agree to processing, storing, sharing the data. The results will be communicated, but then there's also an end. How does this work? Does your data get deleted? Does your tool become obsolete and then people can no longer access it? What happens if a patient dies? Do the data stay there forever, which might potentially have negative consequences for family members that didn't ask for this? So how all these questions need to be answered. And what is very important there is patient education, patient awareness, but also education and awareness of all the stakeholders. And this is how we get to the last letter of the LC acronym, that's the social aspect. Now, a lot of research lately has been, or Europe is giving more and more importance to this LC, and also to responsible research and innovation, to the inclusion of social sciences and humanities in technology research. And when we've been talking to patients, so doing patient focus groups and surveys and talking to patient representatives, patient advocates and organizations, what always comes back is this word trust. How can we help answer questions for patients? Why should they trust this? And trust has many different aspects. So that means that you need to understand what you're talking about, because you cannot trust something if you don't really understand it. So up to a certain level, people need to be educated. There needs to be explainability. There needs to be a level of awareness. There needs to be transparency. And then on the other hand, also as a developer, you can contribute by doing validation, by showing credibility, the technical credibility of the tool that you've created. So all of these aspects need to be there in order to have trust. But sometimes, as a developer, you cannot make the patient or make the user trust your device. You can go as far as do trustworthiness. And then it's, of course, up to the patient's experience, to the healthcare provider's experience to see if they actually trust it. Because a lot of clinicians also say, I trust it when it works in my hands. And if it doesn't work in my hands for whatever reason, I don't trust it. So building on trust is very important. And as I mentioned, what is very important there, what we've also seen with patients, or what is very important is information. And for a lot of patients, this means that they look at the clinician. If the clinician trusts a device, they will also trust this. And so we've been working on a lot of educational material. We've been working on podcasts, on videos, and ultimately also included all of this in an info kit that was meant for developers of in silico tools in healthcare, so that they can go and talk to the patient and to healthcare providers. And they have tools on how to run a Delphi survey, how to run all of these things and create trust or generate trust. All right, then we put all of this together in a puzzle, but we need to also make sure that the puzzle stays. So we need to work on incentivization because, well, we can build the greatest platform ever existed, but if nobody wants to use it, then it will be pretty obsolete or it will be pretty useless. And what is important there, of course, an incentive is going back to the very first thing that I mentioned, that is the need analysis. You need to link this development really very much to the need. And then you need to show how this addresses the need. And you need to incentivize people with things that are relevant for them. If, as an academic, why should I share this? Well, because you get maybe a DOI, and you get something that is an output that you can claim for your CV development. So finding relative incentives, also clinicians that need to do annotation of data sets when they are encoding this takes work for them that not necessarily results in immediate feedback for the patient. But if that means that they are then involved in a study that will use this data set, that their name will be on the paper, that they get access to the results of this study, these might be proper incentives. So this is important. We also need to look at the development of the market. There are some sources that talk to a lot of people that know a lot of things about economy, that have said that digital twins, whether they're used for personalized medicine, for surgical planning, for drug discovery, for healthcare workflow optimization, medical device design and testing, or other applications, that there will be a boom over the next 5 years. It will be global, same in the US as in Europe and the rest of the world. And so that there seems to be a market potential. Now we need to, that means that if the European Commission is going to build this platform, they need to make sure that this also can help create these services, that it can assist companies, but that also maybe the platform itself can become a marketplace where services can be offered and can be used. All right. So very important in sustainability is, of course, also funding. So what we did with the roadmap is really, look at everything that is there, but then also make sure that, we show the Commission the plan, and we did the plan by looking at different phases. So we had a design phase, a develop phase, and a deliver phase for our roadmap. There is the possibility of turning this into a public infrastructure, like there are already. You have Elixir, you have BBMRI, and other life sciences research infrastructures, where we looked at how we can build a platform that is complementary, that is not doing the same thing as is already done, but can be complementary. And then, of course, once we have a plan, we show how it fits with what is already there. We need to make sure that the European Commission is actually sticking to their promise of building this platform. In order to do that, we developed a manifesto. That's a 2-page document that describes what is the global idea of the virtual human twin and what needs to be worked on. And then we asked a whole bunch of companies to sign this, not just Lies from KU Leuven to sign this, but actually the rector or the vice rector of the university to sign this. And we now have over 100 large and small companies, hospitals, academia, academic centers, and other organizations signing this, which is very important because this is also something that the Commission can use internally to say, look, this is what the ecosystem, this is what the community wants. So we need to invest in this. So I described everything that we've done. Now the project is over. Where are we? So we brought together the ecosystem. This is a picture from our last meeting. We had these are about 200 people, but we had over 800 people involved in various stages of this process of developing the roadmap for the virtual human twin. So we designed the roadmap. We had so much, as I explained to you, all these different, the 360-degree view meant that we had so much content that we couldn't trim it down. So it has become something that is over 300 pages, and the final draft is available. We're waiting for the green light from the European Commission to be able to actually officially release it. But we also made a policy brief from this with the high-level content. If we talk to policymakers, that they need to read, the why, the what, the who, but not the how. And what is also in there are the recommendations for how to do this. In order to make this whole roadmap readable, we started, as I actually explained today, we started from the need for the VHT, describing the technology, the infrastructure, the LC standards and regulatory, the users, the uptake, and the sustainability. And then we're ending with recommendations for a successful VHT. We also included a lot of success stories, developments that have been made, use cases where you can see how this actually works, and user stories, like future-looking fictitious stories that can be used in engagements with patients of what this would mean for them, or for academics, or for healthcare providers. So all of these, in order to give everybody that would want to read something about this some anchor in this roadmap. Now, I've also have the list of all the recommendations here, but the recommendation, I'm not going to go through that. They actually follow these structures. So for each of those aspects, like for the need, we had different recommendations, with recommendations for the technologies, for the infrastructure, for the LC, for the user inclusiveness, and for the sustainability, 30 in total, that talk to different people in the commission, but also to all of us, academics, to people in hospitals, to the industry, of what they could do in order to facilitate, to make a success out of the VHT. And we divided it also, it gave it a bit of a timeline, but it's really difficult because you have in digital twins already successful examples in clinics. So, you know, it's a bit artificial to spread this out over time, but since the European Commission has committed to building the virtual human twin platform, they have an official public tender that is now out for 24 million. They're evaluating the proposals that have been submitted. So this is going to be built, and this should be realized by 2028 or something. And so that's one point in time where there will be a clear difference, after which we can start actually using this platform, and we can go from digital twins in health and care at the moment to actually realizing the virtual human twin. And so this will be part of the whole strategy of the European Commission for the virtual human twins, where we have the ecosystem, we have the research, we have the infrastructure, and also the uptake in clinical settings. So getting member states involved, getting the regulators involved, and bridging that last mile, as they call it. Okay, this is everything that I wanted to say.